forgive my attempt to pronounce Chinese, but apparently the Chinese words for 520, the abbreviation for May 20th, sound very much like wo ni, which are the Chinese words for I love you. And thus, May 20th has become an unofficial Internet Valentine's Day in China, although the idea was likely inspired by a Taiwanese pop song. It's celebrated much the way that February 14th is here in the United States, with lovers giving small gifts and celebrating their romance. Very different is Cyclone Day, that is commemorated in the tiny town of Codell, Kansas, population 59, according to the 2020 census, that is remembering the day, May 20th, when tornadoes struck the town 3 years in a row between 1916 and 1918. Clearly, there are a variety of reasons that May 20th deserves to be remembered. On May 20th, 1916, a tornado, estimated to be an F2 on the Fujita scale, passed by the town of Codell, Kansas. Exactly a year later, an estimated F3 tornado passed 2 miles west of town. By 1918, folks were already calling May 20th Cyclone Day, and 1918 would live up to the name as the town took a direct hit from a much larger F4 cyclone. The devastating twister killed 9 residents and injured 65 others. Codell was spared in 1920, but May 20th, 1957 would bring another outbreak to Kansas. In fact, according to the National Weather Service, May 20th was a super outbreak that spawned 35 confirmed tornadoes in Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Missouri. The largest was the Ruskin Heights tornado, which crossed between Missouri and Kansas in the Kansas City area. The massive F5 event tore a path as much as half a mile wide along an astounding 71-mile path. The Weather Service reports the tornado claimed the lives of 45 persons and left hundreds homeless. It was the worst weather disaster on record for Kansas City. All that remained of one house was a small table and a fish bowl atop, with the fish still swimming about inside the bowl. A canceled check from Hickman Hills was found in Ottumwa, Iowa, 165 miles away. May 20th may be seen as a day of liberation for many parts of the world. When on April 11th, 1898, President McKinley asked Congress for authority to intervene in the ongoing insurgency in Cuba, both he and Congress affirmed the goal of recognition of the independence of the people of Cuba. Some in Congress, however, were concerned that U.S. intervention would end up with the U.S. as a colonial power, or even with the annexation of Cuba. To make the matter perfectly clear, Congress added the Teller Amendment, named after Republican Senator Henry F. Teller of Colorado, which essentially barred annexation and required that the U.S. forces evacuate Cuba as soon as self-determination could be achieved. While there was some sincere support for Cuban independence, a substantial motivation was the fear by many U.S. states of competition with the U.S. sugar industry. In any case, Cuba held elections in December of 1901, and U.S. forces left on May 20th, 1902. That didn't actually signal the end of U.S. intervention in Cuba, nor did it prevent the U.S. from acquiring Puerto Rico, Guam, and Philippines in the war, but it did signal the beginning of the Republic of Cuba, which would persist until 1959. On May 20th, 1927, the government of the United Kingdom and the Kingdom of Hejaz and Nejd signed the Treaty of Jeddah. The treaty superseded a 1915 treaty and represented formal recognition of the independence of Ibn Saud and sovereignty over the Kingdom of Hejaz and Nejd. The recognition represented an important step in the creation of the modern Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. On May 20th, 2002, the new constitution of the Democratic Republic of East Timor, along with United Nations Security Council recognition of East Timor independence, ended 24 years of Indonesian occupation and 2 years of UN administration. The date has its role in the independence of the United States as well. On May 20th, 1774, the Parliament of the United Kingdom passed the Massachusetts Government Act, a response to the Boston Tea Party the previous December. The act gave the appointed governor of Massachusetts wide-ranging powers, altering the rules of the Massachusetts Bay Charter. The act decreased the colony's control of government, giving more power to the royally appointed governor and ending nearly a century and a half of democratic tradition in the colony. The act is one of 4 that became referred to as the Coercive Acts or the Intolerable Acts, and these were a primary motivation for the rebellion against the king, called the American Revolution. One man who was attracted by the goals of that revolution was Marie-Joseph Paul-Yves Roche-Gilbert du Motier de Lafayette, Marquis de Lafayette. The French officer found great success as a leader of American troops, including during the decisive siege of Yorktown, and then returned to play a key role in the French Revolution. The hero of the two worlds breathed his last, May 20th, 1834, at the age of 76. 328 years earlier, a figure seen as more controversial today, who was ultimately essential to the events of the American Revolution, died in his bed in Valladolid, Spain. For all that can be said of Christopher Columbus, he was the person most responsible for connecting the old world and the new, perhaps the most momentous event in human history, and one not well understood even in his lifetime. He spent his final years seeking the honors and recognition from the crown of Castile that he believed he was contractually owed. Christopher Columbus's last words were reportedly, "In menis tuis, Domine, commende spirituum meum." In your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. If May 20th represents some of the beginnings of the United States, it also represents the nation's growth. On May 20th, 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act, which gave citizens or future citizens up to 160 acres of public land, provided that they live on it, improve it, and pay a small registration fee. The act had been a primary goal of the Free Soil Party and Republicans since 1848 and was predicated on the idea that lands in the West should be made available to independent farmers. The concern was that the best lands might otherwise go to large plantations who would develop the land using enslaved people, pushing independent farmers onto more marginal lands. The South's secession removed Southern opposition to the law from Congress, allowing its passage. Eventually, the National Archives notes, the government granted more than 270 million acres of land while the law was in effect. May 20th is also an important date for the nation from which the U.S. gained independence. On May 20th, 1514, King Henry VIII created the Corporation of Trinity House of Deptford Strand. The king was seeking to manage problems caused by unregulated pilots on the Thames River. Trinity House, named after the patron saint of mariners, was given a license to regulate pilotage on the Thames. 510 years later, they still hold that license, as well as responsibility for managing lighthouses and navigational aids in England, Wales, the Channel Islands, and Gibraltar. James II of England was deposed in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, replaced by the co-monarchs William and Mary. On May 20th, 1690, William engaged in a startling act of forgiveness, which absolved those who had been supporters of his deposed predecessor from any retribution for their previous treasons. The intent of the Act of Grace was to stabilize the nation, but some of his supporters were outraged. The Secretary of State, George Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, resigned in protest. On May 6, 1910, Edward VII, King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland and Emperor of India, passed away. His state funeral was held on May 20th. Crowds estimated at between 3 and 5 million witnessed the funeral procession, which included 9 European kings, the greatest gathering of European royalty ever to take place. Tornadoes weren't the only disasters to strike on May 20th, and as with any day, the day has its share of terrible things. On May 20th, 1293, an earthquake and tsunami struck the Japanese city of Kamakura, killing an estimated 23,000 people. While one researcher describes the event as at the cusp of written history, archaeological discoveries of mass graves, as well as geological evidence of the tsunami, provide evidence of the disaster. The siege and subsequent sack of the Protestant city of Magdeburg on May 20th, 1631, by forces of the Catholic League is considered to be the deadliest event of the 30 Years' War. Of the city's 25,000 inhabitants, only some 5,000 survived. On May 20th, 1840, a fire was started in the nave of York Minster Cathedral when a careless workman left a candle burning. The fire did damage to the southwest tower and the nave. This was one of the less damaging of the fires at the Minster, which had been stricken by fires in 1753, 1829, 1840, and 1984. On May 20th, 1940, the first prisoners, 30 German inmates categorized as professional criminals, arrived at the newly established Auschwitz concentration camp. They were the first of an estimated 1.3 million people who would be taken to the camp in Poland, primarily Jews, but also Poles, the mentally challenged, Roma people, homosexuals, and Soviet prisoners of war. An estimated 1.1 million of those prisoners, 85%, were murdered in the camp. On May 20th, 1965, a Pakistani International Airlines Boeing 720, carrying 114 passengers and 13 crew, crashed while descending to land at Cairo International Airport, Egypt. After the pilot reported difficulty managing the plane's flaps, the plane apparently kept descending until it hit the ground. 121 of those on board perished, with only 6 survivors. On May 20th, 1970, an empty subway train crashed into a crowded rush hour train as it switched tracks near the Roosevelt Avenue station in Jackson Heights, Queens, New York. The crash was so violent that a car was thrown from the tracks into a concrete barrier, splitting it in two. 2 people were killed and at least 71 injured. In 1989, the Chinese government imposed martial law on Beijing as a response to growing protest. That would be the first step towards the brutal military attack on the protesters called the Tiananmen Square Massacre. But May 20th isn't all doom and gloom. Charles Lindbergh began his record-setting first solo transatlantic flight on May 20th, 1927. Aviatrix Amelia Earhart became just the second person and the first female to complete a solo transatlantic flight 5 years later in 1932, setting off from Harbour Grace, Newfoundland, Canada on May 20th and arriving in Londonderry, Northern Ireland, 15 hours later. On May 20th, 1873, U.S. Patent Number 139121, an improvement in fastening pocket openings, was granted to Jacob Davis and Levi Strauss & Company, creating the iconic riveted Levi jeans. The company's webpage declares, thanks to their new near indestructibility, Levi's became the clothing of choice for the rugged hodgepodge band of workers, outcasts, entrepreneurs, and outlaws building America's future. On May 20th, 1891, members of the National Federation of Women's Clubs were invited to the workshop of the famous Thomas Edison, where they were shown for the first time to the public a device called the kinetoscope, the first device to use a strip of perforated film to create the illusion of movement, the forerunner to the movie projector. Exactly 4 years later, on May 20th, 1895, Woodville Latham showed the film Young Griffo versus Battling Charles Barnett, a film of a boxing match in a storefront at 131 Broadway in New York City on an idealoscope projector that he had invented. It is generally thought to be the first time that a motion picture was projected for a paying crowd in the United States. But May 20th would see 2 notable ends for the small screen. The last episode of the long-running comedy Cheers aired on May 20th, 1993, while unconventional comedian David Letterman hosted the final episode of CBS's The Late Show with David Letterman on May 20th, 2015. He signed off saying, "All right, that's pretty much all I got. The only thing I have left to do for the last time on a television program. Thank you, and good night." And what would any day in history be without a near-civilization-destroying experience? On June 20th, 1993, newspapers reported the startling fact that a meteor that was described as 30 feet in diameter and weighing as much as a Navy destroyer passed within 90,000 miles of Earth, something that astronomers at the time described as the closest encounter yet. With the kicker being that astronomers didn't notice the thing until it had already passed by Earth. How much damage could it have done? Well, Jeff Chester of the National Air and Space Museum told the Washington Post, "I think it would have carved a significant crater, leaving its mark on May 20th, a date which has already hosted so much history." I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.